Hello, I'm Alice Murray. I'm the editor of The Drawdown, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you today to today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to say a huge thank you to We Are Guernsey for partnering with us and making this webinar possible. Thank you. So today we're looking at key considerations for selecting the right fund domicile. There have been several factors that have driven domicile selection up the agenda for private capital funds, notably economic substance requirements and of course Brexit, both of which will be central pillars to our conversation today. However, there are several other factors involved in this decision, which have more recently led to more careful selection processes, and in some cases, migration from existing jurisdictions into new domiciles. These include finding the right regulatory framework for SMAs or bespoke structures, the regulator's approach to the fund space, the availability of professional services, and of course, cost. So with plenty to cover in today's session, I'm going to hand over to our fantastic panelists for a short introduction. So Stephen, I'm going to start with you.
Hi Alice, thank you. Hi everybody. My name is Stephen Branagan. I am Pantheon's Global Head of Operations, but also our head of our Irish office. So in my capacity in those roles, I obviously head up Pantheon's operations function, which straddles across a couple of different jurisdictions, but the funds which we manage also do, so including the Channel Islands, Luxembourg, Delaware and other locations. I also sit on the board of numerous Luxembourg fund structures, and I am a director of Pantheon's AIFM based in Ireland.
Thank you, Stephen. Kate, coming to you.
Hi, my name's Kate Storey. I'm a funds partner in the Guernsey office of Walker's law firm, and Walker's is the largest global offshore law firm with offices in 10 jurisdictions, including the key fund jurisdictions of Guernsey, Jersey, Cayman and Islands. And we practice 6 different laws: Guernsey, Jersey, Cayman, BVI, Bermuda and Irish law. And I've been practicing offshore in Guernsey for getting on for 14 years, doing fund formation and fund regulation matters.
Thank you very much, Kate. And finally, over to you, Andrew.
Hi, Alice. Thanks. And hello to everyone. My name's Andy Maiden. I'm a director of Intertrust Fund Services Guernsey Limited. Have been working within the offshore funds industry for over 20 years, looking after and servicing a number of fund structures, and also including the establishment and setup of fund structures in a variety of locations, including Guernsey, Jersey, Isle of Man, BVI and Cayman. I also sit on a number of the fund boards, GP boards and fund management companies involved with the various fund structures as well.
Excellent, thank you all. So we've got a fantastically well qualified panel to take us through today's discussion. For those that are watching, to our audience, please feel very welcome to ask questions as we're going throughout the discussion. There's a Q&A button, and yeah, write your questions there and I'll do my best to intertwine them into our discussion. Okay, so kicking off the discussion, we're going to look at economic substance and within BEPS. So Kate, I'm going to come to you first for this question. Who does this concern most? Is economic substance of a domicile, is that more important to LPs, or is that a GP thing? Who's kind of pushing on this?
It's primarily important to GPs and the fund managers because it's those entities that have to comply with the EU's requirements on economic substance. So they have to demonstrate that their fund management activities are being carried on in the jurisdiction where they're incorporated or tax resident. So it's primarily important to the manager, but obviously compliance with economic substance is relevant to a jurisdiction's reputation, and an investor won't necessarily want to be investing in a jurisdiction that's been blacklisted because their economic substance framework is not compliant. So I think it's important to both the manager and the investor that economic substance compliance is there.
Thank you. And then Andrew, I'm going to pop this over to you. What do you see when you're working with fund managers? Kind of who's, do you agree with Kate that it's very much in the GP's hands?
I think it is. I think it's, for general partners, it's important for where they want to domicile. But what's becoming more clear these days is that investors are having more of a say. Their needs haven't necessarily changed, but they now feel that it's their way to kind of stamp their authority on where things are domiciled, where funds are domiciled, and having regulatory considerations and kind of blacklisting considerations in mind. Investors don't want to be going to jurisdictions which may not give them the protection that they need as investors. So I think it's important for the general partners, exactly like Kate said, but it's becoming more of an investor-driven market on that side of things.
Excellent, thank you. And Stephen, you get to see really both sides of the coin as an investor and also managing funds. What are you seeing? Are you seeing changes in this space?
I don't necessarily see wholesale changes. I think the points that Kate and Andy made are I'd probably echo. And the key thing is it's a meeting of minds almost, and risk appetite is the thing that comes to the fore. It's the risk appetite of the GP, the fund manager, and making sure that risk appetite matches the risk appetite of the most risk averse LP or investor you have in the funds. If at any stage there's a disconnect between those two, well then you have questions over the domicile. I think that's, in our case at least, it's the primary driver, for any new jurisdictions, and there has to be that matching between our appetite and the investor appetite. Similar to Andy's comment earlier about blacklisting, I can't see any fund manager electively and selectively going after territories or jurisdictions where there's a blacklisting, simply put because they just won't match the risk of their investor base.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And sticking on kind of LPs and their needs in terms of the domicile, Andy, you mentioned that they're wanting to stamp their authority on this, that they are kind of speaking up, and Stephen, as you say, it's about matching that risk appetite. Is there another consideration that might be important from an LP's perspective? And I'm trying to get at, what a GP might be able to offer, and more specifically kind of touching on being able to create more bespoke structures. Does this factor in, Stephen?
Absolutely. I think, equally, or it sits alongside risk appetite is the solution that the investor or the client base needs or wants. So if you think about pre-GFC, there was a very established fund domicile market, and it was very much based on where your last fund was domiciled, and it was rinse and repeat almost. What we've seen since probably mid-2007 is much more familiarity across our client base and across clients generally about jurisdictions, about where they would like their funds to be domiciled, coupled with the fact that a lot more clients are looking for fund of one vehicles, SMAs, and bespoke solutions rather than making commingled commitments into standard funds. So with that, you have an increasingly educated client base with regard to fund domicile and the different operational considerations they pose, matching off against very changing regulatory landscape as well. The launch of AIFMD, Dodd-Frank came in the US in the time period we're talking about. There's been wholesale changes in the last 12 years that have influenced how LP demands have evolved during that time. And we would see it more and more now where clients will have more of a say in terms of the jurisdictions and the domiciles that are chosen for fund of one vehicles, SMAs, or anything up to the commingled vehicles as well. We're all ultimately led and driven by the client's needs. think you're on mute, Alice.
Classic Zoom. So thank you very much. So Kate, what are you seeing in terms of where it comes to jurisdictions and their ability to better house bespoke solutions? Yeah, are there any that you can pick out that are better? What's defining those differences?
I think that's right, that LPs have more negotiating power now, and they can require the structure that fits their bespoke needs. And I think certain jurisdictions really cater for those bespoke solutions that are required, more so than others. For example, Guernsey pioneered the use of the protected cell company, which is a very good platform for housing SMAs. And so there's been an increase in use of cell companies in Guernsey to house those SMA structures. And I think we've also seen a big increase in very private structures, and the Channel Islands do have now established regimes for setting up private funds. In Guernsey it's called PIF, and that's a lighter touch fund structure, fund regime, which is appropriate to the type of sophisticated investors that are investing in these fund structures. That's been a very popular structure in the Channel Islands because of that lighter touch regulation, and the speed of getting the structure established under these private fund regimes. But also in Guernsey, at least, where you've got a single asset vehicle or a single investor vehicle, that doesn't have to be regulated as a fund in Guernsey. So that's an option if you have got single asset, single investor. Use Guernsey for your structure.
Great, nice and clear. Okay, so we touched on, Stephen, you mentioned blacklisting, that managers couldn't imagine managers actively going to set up a fund in a domicile that has been blacklisted. Notably, Cayman was blacklisted. What's been the impact there? Has that motivated LPs to request migrations away from Cayman? Stephen, I'm going to come to you on that one.
Well, it's probably been less pronounced for us. We don't really use Cayman as a primary domicile for our flagship funds. Our primary domiciles are, the traditional structures in the Channel Islands, Luxembourg, Delaware, etc. Traditionally, what we see as the drivers of the use of places like Cayman are client demands, and that's very dependent and very specific or niche to the client needs. So while we don't actively seek that domicile, we're equally happy to listen to clients who have it as part of their jurisdictional strategy. I think in terms of requests for migrations, because we don't really have the Caymans as a primary domicile, we're probably less affected by it than maybe other managers are. But what is clear, even you see it in the SEMA response to the activities earlier on this year. You see an uptick in regulation. You'll see the response coming from the regulatory bodies in the Cayman and others. That will mean that there is this wave of regulation coming the way of the funds that are domiciled there. And really what you'll see across multiple jurisdictions is a competition for the funds that are in Cayman already. So almost not waiting for next month when the Cayman hopefully are removed from the EU blacklisting. There's various different initiatives in most major fund centres to compete for that business, to offer migration packages that make sense to fund managers, but also to the funds themselves. Everything is about ease of migration, ease of re-domiciling, and that will continue for a period of time, because the one thing that fund managers don't like and investors don't like is unpredictability and uncertainty. So the extent to which that creeps into any element of jurisdiction will have an impact in investor conversations, and that's something that most fund managers, including ourselves, are always keen to mitigate and reduce wherever possible.
Absolutely. And on that, we do have a question from our audience regarding this, who says that there is an off-cycle ECOFIN meeting next week to discuss Cayman's blacklist status. Has anyone heard anything?
Not heard anything yet, but I think it's widely believed that certainly in Cayman that they will come off the blacklist in October.
Yeah, from my understanding, I think, like Stephen mentioned, a big piece of regulation was already coming through kind of as they were getting blacklisted. If we hear anything more, we'll keep you posted. Okay, so Andy, coming over to you on just following up on Stephen's point there about so mentioning a kind of a new framework coming through. What's that going to look like when it comes through in Cayman? Would it be enough for fund managers? Would it be suitable?
I think the issue here is that it'll be a new regime. It will be a new for Cayman. It'll be a new regime for them, and I suspect, and having looked at it to date, it'll be quite robust, and it may not be fit for purpose, because it's almost like a one-stop shop to try and capture everything in order to meet the regulations. But actually, as time goes on, I'm sure there'll be tweaks to it. There'll be amendments to it, which is, I think, coming back to Stephen's point, probably a short-term opportunity for other offshore jurisdictions, if I'm being honest, because it'll be too much regulation for some. It won't be enough for others, and with more kind of set in stone and kind of flexible frameworks in other jurisdictions, you can see a few fund managers and a few funds moving and changing domicile in order to have that flexibility that they used to enjoy under Cayman when there was no regulation, but actually still then providing a robust corporate governance and regulatory framework for their fund structures to allow their investors to take advantage of those. So I think it'll probably, like I said, it'll be a one-stop shop, I think, initially, which will develop over time, which is where some of the more established jurisdictions, Guernsey, Jersey, for example, have had their fund framework in place for a number of years, have tweaked it already, and actually is now, pretty much fit for purpose for any type of fund structure you could look to launch.
Excellent. Okay. So then we, potentially seeing a slew of migrations coming from Cayman, and or maybe for other reasons, coming from other jurisdictions. So then thinking about migrations themselves, how does it work? Is it, in essence, is it possible to just pick a live fund up and pop it somewhere else? Kate, from a legal perspective, how does it work? What's the deal?
Well, here in Guernsey, we're certainly seeing greater interest in migrations to Guernsey from jurisdictions who perhaps have lesser substance, less economic substance. And in response to that, in Guernsey, actually Walker's proposed to the regulator a new fast-track migration and licensing regime for fund managers, so that they can easily migrate from another jurisdiction to Guernsey, still manage overseas funds, non-Guernsey funds, but they're able to be licensed and carry on business in Guernsey, do their fund management from Guernsey in respect of those non-Guernsey funds. And that fast-track licensing and migration approval process takes 10 working days. So that's a brand new regime that Guernsey's brought in to facilitate this increased level of interest in migrating to Guernsey. I think there's similar interest in Jersey as well, but Guernsey's obviously brought in this bespoke regime for migrating fund managers. And there's also the ability to migrate the fund itself, whether it's a company or a limited partnership. Both Guernsey and Jersey have recently introduced legislation to enable limited partnerships to migrate to the jurisdictions. So that's a new development as well. So it's very easy. There's the statutory procedures there to quickly and efficiently transfer the company or LP to the Channel Islands. And the beauty of the statutory procedures is that they provide for the transfer of all assets and liabilities of the company to the new co formed in Guernsey or Jersey by operation of law. So automatically all the assets and liabilities of the company get transferred by operation of law to the new co. So from a legal perspective, it's a simple process, and all the assets and liabilities are transferred automatically.
Excellent. That's handy. Andrew, I'm going to come to you. What are you seeing in terms of migration? Is there, these regimes have come in, but is there actual movement?
I think there certainly is, and I think what also drives this on a similar in terms of migrations is economic substance. So that is really implemented. It's been implemented across the world, a lot of offshore jurisdictions. But what we're finding now is that a number of underlying investment structures below the funds, so potentially not the funds themselves, but the underlying investment structures were potentially back in the day set up quickly and easier in maybe BVI, Cayman, or some other similar situations or jurisdictions. And what is now happening is a lot of the work for those underlying structures, the actual administration of those, is being done out of Guernsey or more established fund offshore jurisdictions, Luxembourg, Ireland, Guernsey being examples of that. And what economic substance has said is, well, you're doing all the work in Guernsey, you're having all your meetings in Guernsey, or you're having one in Ireland. Actually, your economic substance in Guernsey. So the Guernsey Revenue Service would say, well, your tax domicile is Guernsey unless you fill out or complete various forms. And so what we're seeing now is fund managers streamlining their activities to say, well, we don't need to be in Cayman, or we don't need to be in BVI, we don't need to be wherever they may be to migrate to Guernsey, to bring them all under one house, so that they're one same tax domicile, but also have the regulatory framework that allows them to, one, migrate, and two, operate as they would do. So it's long gone. You're not completely losing these kind of multi jurisdictional fund structures, but they are starting to become more streamlined to allow them to kind of operate efficiently and meet the economic substance requirements.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it seems to make a lot of sense. Stephen, what are you seeing in terms of substance requirements? Is it just for the fund, or are there other elements that you need to think about?
Yeah, just coming back to one of Kate's points earlier as well, typically it's very dependent on the destination jurisdiction in terms of how easy that process is. And, you know, a lot of the jurisdictions that are trying to attract funds by way of migration have set up regimes that make it very easy. It's, you know, everything from thinking about, does it create a new legal entity, or does it keep its existing legal form and just transfer directly, which prevents a transfer tax? It maintains the performance track record of the fund. You know, all of these things are actually really important elements of making destination jurisdictions really attractive for fund managers. In terms of substance, what thematically we've seen probably over the last number of years is that economic substance as a topic has been mainly focused on the management company and the fund manager. Now what you're seeing, particularly with the evolution of some of the fund structures that have their own legal personality, is that economic substance is more important, or is equally as important for the funds themselves. So thinking about the ecosystem that's in place. You know, what does the panel of board directors look like in the destination? What does the panel of available fund service providers look like? You know, how do you support what is a company in all manner of form, really? You know, that's really important now. Andy made the point as well that, you know, increasingly you see either a very streamlined and very efficiently run multi-jurisdiction or cross-border platform, or you'll see a platform centralized in one location. So, you know, that's typically what we would see from a Pantheon perspective across the landscape, not just specific to us.
Excellent. Okay, great. So we all seem to be nice and aligned on this. Stephen, I'm going to come back to you, kind of given what you see and sitting in between investors and funds. What about Brexit? Obviously, we're getting closer to the end of the transition period. It's still not clear what kind of deal we're looking at, if any. But I guess all you could do now is maybe prepare for the worst and think that UK-based managers will become third-party managers. Does this impact domicile selection, or are you super late coming to the party if you're only thinking about this now?
I think, yeah, I think that's a rhetorical question at the end. I think the vast bulk of all managers have already either executed or have gone 99% of the way in terms of their execution of operational plans. I think from our perspective, at least, we've always assumed that it would be a hard Brexit, and I think a lot of managers will be in the same boat in planning for the worst and hoping for the best, quite honestly. I think the advantage of thinking about funds and platforms in certain jurisdictions as separate entities almost is that, you know, the function of where the AIFM is based or the manager is based is almost, it's not quite an afterthought, but it's a factor of the operational plan. If you support the fund platform, wherever that may be, you know, where the fund is managed from is the element that you need to fix for. So, yeah, yes, there will be an impact, you know, and depending on how that deal looks, you know, we just don't know what that impact or the extent of that impact will be. You know, regulatory divergence is a big topic, you know, so big that we won't address it, nor would we be able to address it within this hour. But that's going to be a key part of contingency planning for UK-based managers for a number of years. But I think for a lot of those managers, as I've said, I think they've executed on plans already. I think there are very few who are left sitting on their plans waiting to execute between now and year end.
Yeah, I'd agree. Okay, so you mentioned there this splitting up, thinking of the Manco and the funds and having them as separate entities. So I guess thinking more about cross-border structures. Andy, you've talked about kind of streamlining SMAs and SPVs, but where are we kind of on cross-border structures within this context?
I think it's almost the opposite, actually, on the manager side, because what we are starting to see is a bit of a hybrid management structure. So you'll still have your UK fund manager, for example, if we're looking at Brexit, but actually now setting up satellite or parallel management structures in Ireland, Channel Islands, Luxembourg, for example, where it's almost like hedging their bets in effect. So that without knowing what Brexit will do and how that will interact, splitting out their jurisdictions in the management companies to understand that they're then ready for hopefully ready for any eventuality. So the actual licensing of managers in these various jurisdictions, we are starting to see an uptick on, certainly, because the actual regulatory framework allows them to do that and actually works for them from a business perspective.
Excellent. Kate, what are you seeing on this? What are your thoughts?
Well, in terms of Brexit and AFMD, Guernsey's, first of all, it's not part of the UK, it's not part of the EU, it's always been a third country for the purposes of AFMD. And so Guernsey, Jersey, other offshore jurisdictions are well used to being third countries and using the national private placement regimes in the various EU member states to market funds into Europe. And so we've been doing it for a decade. So we're sort of, we've been in the position that the UK is now in for a long time. We've got a lot of experience of dealing with being a third country and marketing into the EU, and the national private placement regimes work very well for Guernsey, Jersey and other offshore jurisdictions.
Fab. Okay, excellent. Okay, so sticking with the MPPRs and you know, excellent ways around you know, excellent channels of distribution. Actually, we've got an interesting question here coming in from one of our audience members. So it says, what do you think post-Brexit future holds for MPPR / current AIFMD regulation? Kate, I imagine you're best placed to answer that.
Well, originally, eventually the NPPR was supposed to be phased out, but nobody knows when that will be. And you know, they can't just switch it off just like that. So in the meantime, NPPR will continue, and Guernsey is very well placed to take advantage of that. But I mean, Guernsey is AFMD ready. We were at the point of getting the third country passport when Brexit happened, and it was actually Brexit that prevented us from getting that. So we're ready to go when necessary.
Yeah, that's definitely, Brexit's been fun for that. I get adding to that, we at the Drawdown, we looked into the recent AIFM proposals from ESMA, and it notably had very little on NPPRs. I think there was a concern that they know they needed to either harmonise them or maybe think about phasing them out. And I think at the moment it looks towards all they would look to do is greater harmonisation, because I think there is an understanding that they are such a vital lifeline for funds, obviously in the Channel Islands and soon to be in the UK. Okay, so sticking on kind of, you know, yeah, distribution, marketing, investor relations, and when it comes to investor onboarding, this is a real key frustration, has been for a long time in the market, in terms of getting investors through KYC and AML checks. Is there anything to be said about what domiciles are doing here that might influence a decision? Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a recurring hot topic, one which boards of directors and managers, you know, discuss regularly, I'd imagine, across the globe. I think the summary is that there's no domiciliation or regulatory arbitrage in our view when it comes to AML or KYC. Nobody wants to be seen as the manager who's seeking out territories where AML or KYC standards are lower than others, for a perceived ease of doing business or onboarding clients. We're all operating in an environment where typically from an AML and a KYC perspective, at least, a lot of fund managers look to gold plate. So they look at the highest standards of AML or KYC in the territory in which they're marketing or distributing, and they adopt that. And they try as uniformly as possible to roll that out across the rest of their jurisdictions or where they're regulated. And typically, that presents challenges, obviously, in making sure that things are homogenized across multiple territories. But in our view and in our experience, that there are some intricacies or niche areas that are specific to some territories, but by and large, it's 95% consistent across the board. So we don't actively look at territories who would fall short of that. It comes back to the same topic as we opened on, which is risk appetite. Investors really don't want to be exposed to a territory that has an X against its name for AML and KYC rather than a tick mark, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, excellent. That's exactly what you'd hope. Okay, Andy, what do you see when it comes to these investor onboarding frustrations?
Yeah, I think for managers and investors, there is some frustrations. And I think, as Stephen mentioned, having high AML standards is key and a given across the 95% of the offshore jurisdictions and any jurisdictions around the world. I think they'll all have relatively similar AML and CDD requirements, but one of the key factors, I think, is from a regulatory flexibility standpoint. Some jurisdictions will have a very hard and fast, black and white, this is what you must do, and this is how it must work in terms of you must have this, you must have this, and you must have this. I think one of the key things for jurisdictions is where they can be flexible and have maybe like Guernsey has, a risk-based approach, so that you're not always having to look exactly at what the rules say. There is some commercial flexibility around. Well, if you want investors from the Middle East, for example, getting a utility bill from them without a PO box number is almost impossible. But actually, then getting kind of signed letters and Google searches and things like that from respected lawyers or people like that, where you can say this is their address, then there's ways of doing that, and the regulatory AML kind of handbook will allow you to do that. So I think that's a key one. I think all managers, investors want a high threshold AML framework, but maybe not always want to provide the information. So there's a bit of a balancing act somewhere in between, but where you can have flexibility within the framework, then that's certainly got to be a help.
Mm-hmm. And Kate, what do you think, or what do you think managers should be looking for in terms of a regulator?
I think it's important that the regulator is pragmatic and sort of accepts electronic CDD, and in Guernsey that is the case, and the GFSE issued guidance back in April at the height of the pandemic, saying that local administrators could verify clients using video calls and taking screenshots of their faces and passport and utility documents. And so I think it's just taking a flexible approach and embracing technology when dealing with AML onboarding.
And just sticking on that, obviously the last 6-7 months have been hugely impactful, have seen massive changes in every walk of life. What do you think the pandemic has done in terms of your domicile and where you're based, and how you are able to properly govern your funds in whichever domicile?
I think the pandemic's really highlighted those jurisdictions that don't have economic substance on the ground, those jurisdictions that are more reliant on inward travel of workers, perhaps struggling more than others. So in Guernsey, we've been able to demonstrate that we can carry on business as usual, nearly, not quite business as usual, but it's near to it as possible. And we've only got 2 active cases of COVID in Guernsey at the moment, and that's after a period of over 3 months with no active cases at all. And so, in terms of, the health management has been very good in Guernsey. I think we've really shown our stability as a jurisdiction in being able to deal with a pandemic.
Yeah, I'd say. Okay, so sorry, going back to investor onboarding and technology. Stephen, what's your take on kind of what's happening in terms of the investor onboarding tech, and then, you know, in light of recent events?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting how regulators and fund managers and funds have had to adapt in the last 6 months. You know, previously what were considered as nice to have bits of technology are now commonplace. You know, if you think about DocuSign, I think, you know, the fact that we're talking on Zoom, you know, is a perfect example of, you know, where technology has now become almost a prerequisite for some of the things where we never really thought it was needed. I think if you think about, particularly in the AFMD space, and particularly where the client base is predominantly institutional, it's probably lagged. It's fairly safe to say it's lagged behind some of the more transactional environments where, you know, CDD, KYC, AML tools have been, you know, they've been converted to technology quite a number of years ago. You see it in quite a lot of the retail channels where onboarding of clients in a speedy way is actually crucial to the business model. And what I think will happen, partly in response to COVID, but partly as a commercial necessity, is that you'll see that digitalization of the client onboarding experience happening across private markets and institutional investors. And, you know, that can take any number of different forms, but clearly in an ever increasingly complex environment, the need for technology is actually growing exponentially rather than in line with that. So you think about UBO registry filings, you think about all of the different regulatory requirements that are coming down the track now. You know, with the best will in the world, most fund managers, they just don't have the option to throw headcount at it. It is not the solution. Technology is the solution, and you know, I think it's going to be an interesting 3 to 5 years across the institutional investor landscape as to how that's dealt with.
Mm-hmm. And Andy, coming over to you, I mean, as a fund administrator, it's often it rests on your shoulders to really look at this and get this right and make it work. What are you seeing in terms of automation?
So I think, yeah, the fintech opportunity within the AML space is massive, and like Stephen says, it has to change, and I'm sure it will change. You know, we're already starting to see introduction of blockchain regarding wallets of investor AML passports and CDD. We're also looking at kind of seeing AI and robotics in terms of investors uploading their own passports, AI reviewing that passport and updating kind of internal systems, sending out automated kind of reminders based on that information. So it never touches a human being, which is great. And you know, you're starting to see the technology develop now. I think, you know, in this day and age, especially with COVID going on, you know, it's not easy to print something, you know, get wet ink signatures and send it off. So that whole process has to change and is changing, and actually sending bits of paper around the world, probably from a risk-based approach, is not the most safest way to be doing things. So, you know, where you've got secure automation, secure technology, that will certainly help. And it's definitely something, it's a huge growth area. And I think that has to change, because it's such a revenue drain on kind of administrators as a whole, because pushing paper around for passports is not the best use of people's time when we're trying to move into an automated and kind of more fintech era within this space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Fab. Okay. Let's I think let's move on to professional services. So we're talking about kind of we've addressed what the regulators can do and what you should be looking for, but it seems like it needs to be an alignment between the risk profiles or risk appetites of GP and LP. But I imagine, as well as having a robust regulatory framework that is understanding of private capital funds and all the interesting things that they want to do, you're also going to need to make sure that you've got a deep enough kind of panel or range of professional service providers in that domicile. Kate, coming to you, what do you think, how important would you say that this is, and which jurisdictions are getting this right?
I think quality of service providers and substance on the ground is one of the absolute major key factors, or should be in domicile choice. You know, Guernsey, Jersey have been whitelisted in terms of their economic substance compliance, so they're clearly getting it right. There's a wealth of fund administrators, independent directors, lawyers, auditors, and investment professionals on the island here, you know, that box is ticked for Guernsey. I think I had an interesting example recently where we launched Guernsey's first cannabinoid healthcare fund. I think innovation, diversifying into innovative asset classes like that is important for a jurisdiction. So, the client for that fund looked at 5 leading international finance jurisdictions and selected Guernsey at the end because Guernsey was transparent and clear on its cannabis regulation policy. And so, you couldn't necessarily have launched that fund in all of the jurisdictions. So, I think quality of service providers and innovation are key factors in a fund domicile.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Stephen, how important is it to you? Obviously, you get to see, you're on a whole range of structures. So what difference does it make, kind of the expertise that you've got on the ground for those structures?
Yeah, I think it's critical, really. It's probably boils down to 2 words, and that stability and predictability of wherever it is you're considering. Actually, interestingly enough, for us at least, I know it was mentioned earlier on, cost is probably, it's a function of where you choose, not the driver of where you choose. It's really about the territory, the jurisdiction. You see quite a lot in the last number of years in terms of the responsibilities on fund managers to look at outsourcing, the delegated provisions of outsourcing, how you need to supervise them, how you take them on, how you verify that they're appropriate, etc. So the extent to which you can front load a lot of that checking at the outset and not have to worry about it on an ongoing basis is pretty critical. So it's everything from looking at how predictable is the regulator, how easy is the application process for establishment for regulated GPs or vehicles, how established is the service provider landscape. So everything from upfront legal advice all the way through to administration, COSEC services, depositories where relevant, or custodians. But then also thinking about how do you go to the next level? What is the next layer? It's the people at those businesses. How stable is the employment market? How much of an emphasis do they place on education at 3rd level and beyond for the particular services they are offering? We tend to refer to it as the ecosystem that supports the funds. Mm-hmm. It has to be stable. It has to be predictable. It has to be almost like a central pillar of that industry and that sector of whatever jurisdiction you're looking at. Because at the end of the day, when you're, particularly in our sector, when you're looking at a closed-ended fund, you're committing to the jurisdiction for 15 years. So you have to be pretty confident that relationship will stand that test of time. Otherwise, you're creating a false sense of economy for yourself, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. essentially.
Absolutely. And Andy, coming to you, lots of points raised there, but kind of sticking on the quality of the service professionals, but also cost. Stephen mentioned it wouldn't be a key driver of which domicile, but what do you see in terms of, is there a huge difference between different jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think Stephen did touch on this, but I think, a lot of offshore fund jurisdictions will have relatively similar regimes, regulatory regimes, AML requirements, etc., etc. Service providers. There are a number of global service providers that will operate in most of the jurisdictions that we're talking about. So I think you get the stability there. But I think what the key thing is you can have a fund structure in one domicile which kind of meets your requirements, but you could pay an absolute fortune for that. Whereas you could be doing it in another jurisdiction, same regulatory oversight, same kind of a regime, but actually getting it done for a lot less money in terms of how they've set it up, the reasons for setting up, and what you're trying to do in that jurisdiction. So I think it's key to understand what you need the fund to do and what investors want the fund to be doing, which will then allow you to pick a jurisdiction, because I think you need to get the price versus what you actually need in the same way. So I think, like I said, you could go to Luxembourg, for example, set up a fund, which would be quite expensive, but you actually wouldn't need the high level of oversight that the regulator gives over there. Whereas you could do something in Cayman, Guernsey, Jersey, very similar to what you would have done in Cayman or into Luxembourg, but actually a fraction of the price. So I think it's what do you need and how do you match that price up to that, which I think is really important for managers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, so we are nearing the end of our time. We've covered a lot of ground. There's definitely several moving parts to this, and whether that's selecting the right domicile for an upcoming fund or for bespoke structures or for individual deals or single assets. So there could be plenty of different needs. So what I'm going to do now is just come to each of you just for a kind of concluding statement. Just if you were sat with a CFO or a COO of a private capital fund and they didn't know where to turn, what would be the kind of highlights from the things that we've discussed today or haven't discussed today that you think is worth thinking about within this context? So Kate, I'm going to start with you.
So I think that the key factors are quality, stability, and innovation, and that's what you're looking for in a jurisdiction. Quality in terms of service provision, substance on the ground, and it being a well-regulated but proportionately regulated jurisdiction. Stability in terms of being able to cope with things like a global pandemic. Guernsey being outside of Brexit, having always been a third country, and knowing how to market into the EU already as a third country. So it is pretty much as near as you can be business as usual in Guernsey right now. And then, as I said, innovation, embracing technology and new and esoteric asset classes. I think can you do that in your chosen fund domicile?
Fab, thank you. And Stephen, I think perhaps we already have yours. You mentioned that it is, in line with what Kate's saying, that it's really about that stability and that predictability. Is that what your those are your two key words?
Yeah, I think so. From an operational perspective, it is, the launch of a new product is always high execution risk. So you need to have a jurisdiction and a domicile that allows you to measure that. You'll never mitigate it or get rid of it. That allows you to design products, to Kate's point, that are innovative and meet, either product demands or distribution channel demands. And then that give you really good visibility on how you're going to operate that fund over quite an extensive period of time. And the challenge is doing all of that without jeopardizing your ability to raise capital. It's as simple and as complicated as that at the same time. I think the jurisdictions that we've seen in terms of the established fund centres that are out there at the moment have all done that really, really well at probably different stages, but they're all have their virtues and their merits, and they've done elements of it really, really well. But they're all not quite homogenised, but they're all aiming for the same things, which is the ability to do all of those things.
Excellent, thank you. And then finally, Andy, your concluding remarks.
I would say, actually, I think I completely agree with everything that Kate and Stephen have said. I think for fund managers themselves, I think they need to have a very clear idea of what they want the fund to do. So what is their investment strategy? How do they want it to operate? Because I think there are a number of offshore jurisdictions will give them there are a number of experts within those that will help them, guide them, to allow them to be able to do that. There is a wide variety of fund structures, fund regimes where they're out there. And I think, trying to have a clear understanding of what you want the fund to do, to then allow advisors and experts to kind of guide them through that process to make sure they find the right domicile, but also find the right regulatory regime around that. So having a clear picture of what they want the fund to do is critical, because that allows everyone else to kind of work around them to make sure that they get what they need in terms of experience, stability, location and domicile, etc.
Excellent. That's yeah, I'd say that's very sound advice. Great. All right, well, look, I think this has been expansive and hopefully very informative. Thank you, Kate, Stephen, Andrew, for your time and your wonderful expertise. And thank you all very much for watching.